Hello everyone, and welcome to my fourth and final fundamental in my support fundamentals series in comps and identity. So we can play many games of League, hundreds of games, and we always feel a different experience each time. Now why is that? And in my opinion, most of it can be explained by comps and identities. There are so many different champs, so many different strengths and weaknesses that these champs have, and they all interact with each other in different ways. So we feel a new experience almost every time we play. So it's up to you to figure out how to play accordingly to each comp and your champ's identity. So hopefully I can help to provide some framework for you to approach this in this video. Although you don't need to know every single matchup across the entire map and all of the specific details, having a rough idea of how each champ's identity, including yours, fits into a comp is definitely important. So my previous fundamentals have been mainly focused on the early game, as I don't see as much value in considering mid to late game scenarios if there is so much to improve on in the early game, and most games are decided straight out in the early game as well. But there's also more mid to late game variability, and this becomes, there's more information to process, there's more things to keep in mind. So just bear that in mind. This is going to be a very information-heavy fundamental, but it is relevant in all moments of the game. So in this video, I'm going to cover your champ's identity, Botlane identity, Sololane identity, and team identity. I also encourage you to check out and work on my earlier fundamental videos first, which contains more generalized concepts. Okay, let's get into it. Alright, we're going to start with your champion's identity. So I'm going to break up supports into general classes where champs in these classes fit relatively the same general purpose. Let's start with engagers. These are the Alistairs, the Leonas, Nautiluses, Rakans, Rels. These are the most popular engagers. And what they want to do is they want to pressure from fog in the laning phase. They want to use their relics to get level 2, find those all-ins, have kill threats, have the wave pushing into them so that they have enough space to engage. So that's the early game. And then in the mid to late game, they excel in team fights. And you want to be patient with your team fight because you only get one combo. You only get to use your spells once in a team fight realistically, and then job's done. And this is the fun part in playing these engaging champs, is that if you pick that perfect moment to use your cooldowns, you can carry a team fight instantly. So this is, if you're playing a champ like Alistair, you're not just mindlessly comboing the front line and then you're going to be useless for the next 10 to 15 seconds. You want to really make sure that you're moving backwards and forwards, you're being patient, you're picking your right moment to engage, and when that moment presents itself, bam, you pull the trigger. So that's how you want to generally approach the early lane and then the mid to late game. In team fights, you want to set yourself up for success in these team fights. You want to be in position. You want to avoid having to funnel through chokes. You want to be near the team fight in the river, set up before your opponents, and just give yourself the best opportunity to be able to find that perfect engage and potentially access their backline, if that's what your champ looks to do. So for engagers roaming, you want to pressure bot river aggressively. You want to control between mid and bot and just threaten and fog. You can even bot dive. You can even dive bot with your aftershock and with your inherent tankiness. And you also want to link up with your mid and your jungler in the early game when you're roaming for that kill threat. Okay, so that's engagers. Let's move on to enchanters now. These are the Jannas, the Karmas, the Lulus, Namis, Sonas, Sorakas. I ran out of space here, but the list goes on. There's Yuumi, there's Zillion. You can even maybe class Senna as an enchanter. But they all serve a similar purpose in terms of scaling. They want to approach the early game by either making it a war of attrition and getting an HP lead, but when They can't do that anymore. They just need to scale. They need to stay healthy. They need their wave to be near their side of the lane so that they can farm up safely. They want to avoid volatility and 2v2 all-ins because their win condition is going to be in that mid to late game when you are with your team, you're playing front to back and you're just peeling your ADC, and then you're going to be outperforming the other classes of supports. So how you want to use your roam windows as enchanters is you want to ensure your win condition. You want to ensure that you can scale. So you are avoiding these even number fights and skirmishes. You're very susceptible to being caught in rotating and roaming and everything. So you want to use your roams defensively to ensure that your team has the correct vision that is needed to scale. You're warding defensively for your bot lane to farm up. Maybe you're dropping some defensive vision around the mid lane so that you don't get roamed on by their mid laner and your mid laner is more safe to farm as well. It's all about ensuring that win condition. And yeah, in team fights, in the front to back, you want to make sure that you actually have a front so that you can do the front to back. You don't want to be face checking. You don't want to be splitting off and being all, split off and people can get picked off. You're very susceptible to getting picked off. You need your front line in front of you so that you can use your spells on them so that you can't get engaged on. And then you can, at the same time, peel and buff your ADC so that you just win the DPS and the sustain war in the team fight. And that's your win con. You don't have to do anything special. You just have to keep in mind what your identity is as an enchanter. Okay. So if you are playing an enchanter, you want to be patient as well and wait for your opponents to make ill-advised engaged decisions. You don't have to get all angsty and try to throw out your spells to poke and then you get caught out. Just merely playing the front to back will naturally win for you. That's enchanters. Let's talk about mages. These are the Luxes, the Brands, the Zyras, the Xeraths. I would say those are the most common that you would see. Obviously, you can play a lot more mages, but it is quite high risk, I would say, with medium rewards. But what you have to do as a mage is you need to get prior in the bot lane. You need to poke, and you need to just dominate your opponent. You need to keep them under their tower. You need to be looking for windows to poke them down and then have the kill threats and then be willing to pull the trigger. And if you ever drop the ball in that regard and you are susceptible to getting all-ins, then your champ can become very useless very quickly. They don't have that mid to late game scaling that enchanters can fall back and rely on. So keep that in mind if you are a mage player. And in the mid to late game, you want to position selfishly in team fights. You want to be absolutely sure that no one can engage on you. And then you want to just maximize your DPS. And you want to be able to throw out your spells. And the good thing about mages is that they can access the enemy backline without having to flank or do anything like that. They typically have a lot of range and they can damage through the enemy's front line. And in terms of roams for mages, you want to ensure that your lane can win as hard as possible in that 2v2 situation. So you want to use your wards selfishly and aggressively. You want to ward for your lane, and you want to ward in the enemy jungle so that you have enough vision and enough information to keep dominating the 2v2 matchup. Okay, so that's mages. Let us move on to playmakers. So this is primarily Bard, Thresh, and Pike. These champs excel at roaming around, making picks, creating chaotic game states, having a lot of small skirmishes, having number advantages. And they also have very high skill ceilings. These are... it's hard to class these champs because they're all so volatile and unique. But I would say they are self-sufficient. Their engage is quite non-committal. They have quite a lot of self-peel or disengage. And they reward confidence and proactivity. They have important skill shots. And their kits want you to constantly be looking to make plays happen. That's why they are playmakers. So I can't generalize their laning phases. They are different for each of them. They're very unique. but they are all typically outperformed in 5v5s. So come mid to late game, you should be looking for plays around the side lanes for skirmishes to keep that chaotic game state, because you will be outperformed by engagers and enchanters in a straight up front to back 5v5. So you avoid that. You look for kills on the sides and jungle, look for picks, control vision, and roam around and force number advantages for your team. So in terms of laning phase, Pyke and Thresh do have very aggressive laning phases. They want to look for kills and inject a lot of volatility in the 2v2. They're very unique in having so much kill threat, especially in level 2. Pyke's is almost unparalleled. Thresh, especially with Glacial, has a lot of kill threat and pick threat as well. Bard, on the other hand, he wants to more so lose gracefully to level 6 and then look to roam and permanently roam and make plays. I will be coming out with individual champion guides at a later date, but that's just going to be a general overview for these champs for now. So for playmakers, you can index into mobility. And by that, I mean items and rune setup. These are the only champs where Mobies is actually viable and where the domination tree in terms of zombie and relentless hunter can be the best option. All right, now for the final class, this is the counter picks. This is the Brahms, Morgs, Tarms, and Tariks. These champs should be very hard to blind pick, and therefore it should be very hard to main these champions, because you're not always going to get a counter pick into the champs that you want to verse, of course. But they can counter entire enemy compositions when they're picked at the right time, and they can be very overwhelming and just completely neutralize what the enemy team's win condition is. So you need to know what the champs actually counter. They have a unique but clear niche. And you need to think about why your champ is good against the enemy team and make sure that that actually happens. Let's say you're playing Morgana. Her E stops single target CC abilities. So let's say you're playing versus like a Sejuani jungle, or maybe there's like an Ashe, or maybe a TF mid or something like that. You get the picture. You need to make sure that you're using your Black Shield as a reactive ability. You're countering what the enemy team wants to do. That's why these are counter picks. You need to hold on to your core spell so that you get the most value out of it. You don't want to be constantly using Morg's E. You don't want to be constantly using Brahms E or Tarms R or Tarik's R just when it's not totally stopping what the enemy team wants to do. So just to elaborate a little bit more, Morgana is great versus single target CC. Braum is great versus low range and hard engage, and also by stopping important projectiles. This could be Ezreal ults, Nami ults, Syndra ults. There's going to be a lot of examples in that sense, but he does struggle a lot in laning phase, so he's very hard to blind pick. Same with Tarik, but he's more so good versus low range supports so that he can actually get through the lane, and hard engage comps. This is where there's like a huge wombo combo from the enemy team. And this is where Tarik is slightly different to Braum, where Braum wants individual melee members to engage on his team so that he can peel back, but Tarik can stop a big AoE wombo as well. Champs like Fiddle or Vlad or Kennen will all struggle, or even Hecarim, they will all struggle to engage versus Tarik. And if they don't engage, then they're useless. And if they do engage, you ult reactively and then they're useless again. So this is what I mean by making sure that your counter actually happens. And then Tarm is good versus single target burst and lockdown. And he can also be quite a lane bully at the same time. So this is where you want to use the rest of your kit, your Q, your W, your E, quite proactively and aggressively, but then you save your ult for the perfect moment so that the enemy team can't engage, which is what their comp needs to do if you have picked time. So again, these are also quite unique champions by themselves, and individual guides will definitely come in the future. But just keep in mind what you are actually countering and be reactive. Make sure you are getting the most out of your valuable ability. Each class has its own champion pool, its own identity, and there's a lot of information that you want to process for each class, as well as the individual champs. So this is why I recommend choosing one of these classes and choose a class that you enjoy the playstyle. It suits your personality. You kind of click with how you're supposed to play the class. You have fun, you're more comfortable and confident, and that'll lead to maximum improvement. So just for a quick example, if you like to be really proactive, you always like to make things happen. You always want to look for, flashy plays or outplays or being the engaging factor. Obviously, you want to be the engager. You can also consider the playmakers. If you more so like to scale up and you don't like to look for fights the whole time, maybe you want to play more slowly, more methodically, then a pick from the Enchanter class could work a lot better for you. But just make sure that you actually do enjoy it and it suits you. Because something that is a bit of a misconception, especially the higher elo that you get, is that you want to be able to play every champ, and that's just completely false. You can easily stick to one class of champion and make it very, very high on the ladder. There are a lot of one-tricks in Challenger in every region as well, so keep that in mind. With that being said, if you are going to play the Engager or the Enchanter class, I would recommend picking 2 to 3 champions within this class and just playing them in solo queue. So that your information does not get in the way of learning the fundamentals of the game. You can still have a few variations in the class, different champs, just so you can get a better feel and identity of the class holistically. But trying to play every single champion in the class might make it a bit tough to focus on what's important. So yeah. In terms of playmakers, these are very unique, very high skill ceiling champions that I would recommend to honestly just one-trick one of them. If you really enjoy Bard or Pike or Thresh, try to play all of them. They all have different functions. So for playmakers, I recommend just one-tricking. And then for counter picks, this is very hard to give advice on in solo queue because they're so hard to pick in the first place. This is more if you really get a feel of how drafts are playing out and you see that one of these champs just cucks the entire enemy team, then you can consider them. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend them too much. And in terms of mages, I think these are more so tailored towards lower elo, like silver and below, maybe gold as well. But these would also fall under the 2 to 3 champions advice for this class. Let's talk about bot lane identity as a whole now. You want to have an idea of how to play the lane before you play the lane. Support matchup is important, but also taking the whole 4-player lane into account plays a big part in formulating a plan for the lane. And you really want to have a plan for when you approach the lane. So a lot of this comes down to knowing the strengths and the weaknesses of the ADCs. Maybe your bot lane has a lot of kill threat at level 6. Maybe you need to scale up and farm, minimize early game, lose gracefully. Or maybe you want to poke and wave control early. Or maybe the ADC itself is self-sufficient, like an Ezreal or a Ziggs, and you really want to find windows to roam around. The biggest thing that I want to encourage when approaching bot lane identity is thinking critically and actively trying to figure out what each bot lane brings to the table and critically thinking about the champion's kits. There will be a trial and error element to this approach where you want to come up with a plan, implement it, see how it works out, learn from the results, and then your future plans will be a lot better accuracy. But what I will do is I'm going to briefly talk about common ADCs and what they excel at. So, all-in champions. The first ones that come to mind are Kai'Sa and Samira and maybe Tristana. They prefer engages, they want all-ins, they like the 100-0 kind of fights. So supports that would synergize well with them are playmakers in lane and engages just throughout the game. Jinx and Kate, they want permanent priority. They want to avoid even playing field fights. They want a war of attrition advantage over the enemies. They want to just clear the waves. And they prefer enchanters and peelers paired up with them. The Ashe, Varus, and Jins, they like early poke and prio, and they're really strong at level 6. So they spike when they get their ultimate, and then you have a lot more kill threat, and you want to be gravitating towards them at that time, or maybe to pick up and engage support to pair with them so that you have kill threat at level 6. And then there's the Israels and Vaynes, which have really low prio, very low wave control and wave clear, and what they need is low volatility to just scale up, get some items, and they too would also prefer some form of enchanter or peeler. Now I know I haven't mentioned every ADC in League, but I really do want to encourage critical thinking and figuring out what your ADC wants out of the lane. So you can use this knowledge to either adjust the pick you are playing with these ADCs to match their strength, or you can use their wave clear level to determine how to approach early prio in the lane, or how much kill threat you have in the early levels, or at level 6, or even how you play out your champ. Let's say you're playing an engager, like a Nautilus or a Leona, and you have a very passive scaling pick, like an Ezreal or a Vayne. What you want to do is more so be oriented towards the roaming, towards linking up with your mid and jungler to get these picks and these kills to utilize your kit. You would be looking for much less 2v2 volatility, but you also can be setting up your own bot lane to have ganks from your team. If your Ezreal and Vayne wants low volatility, they're going to lose prio, they don't have much wave clear, you can have the wave on your side of the lane, and you can either roam when your mid and jungler can't come down to help or gank, or you can set up the gank in lane when they do have a window. So that's just one example of thinking actively about how to make the most of your bot lane matchup. Another example of what you can do is just adjusting your pick within the class that you play to match the lane a little bit better. So let's go back to that Ezreal/Vayne example. If you are an engager champ and you do see you have an Ezreal or Vayne, it might be a better idea to pick a champ like Alistar, who has a weaker laning phase and excels in roaming and in team fights especially. Whereas Nautilus and Leona, a lot more of their kit is about that laning and trading strength. If your ADC wants volatility and you play enchanters, so let's say there is a Samira or a Kai'Sa or a Tristana, there aren't many good enchanters that can really back up their kit, but in that situation, you can either play your enchanter champions a lot more aggressively because you don't have to be as scared of those 2v2 all-ins if your ADC is tailored to 2v2 all-ins, right? You could also pick the most aggressive enchanter champion like Karma to have as much lane threat as possible to match your ADCs. I'm really not a fan of giving so much information in such a short period of time. It feels like I'm going to be overwhelming everyone. But I think that's just the nature of comps in a game that has so many different variations with champs and who they played with and everything. With that being said, for the rest of Identities, we're going to have a lot less of this information overload and hopefully a lot more actionable and digestible information for you. So, for mid-lane Identity, this is determining how volatile the mid-lane matchup is. It's not going to be super in-depth, it's just what do your mid-laners want to do. Is there a Azir and a Corki matchup? Are they just trading farm? Are they safely wave clearing? Maybe they even have some mobility to disengage like an Azir or a Corki does. And your roams towards mid are much less likely to result in a big success, right? The most you can realistically do is just help your mid laner shove and find a base. And maybe in that situation, you are more drawn to playing around bot river or bot. So let's run through a hypothetical. You crashed a wave bot. It's a good wave state. You have a roam window. but the mid lane matchup is extremely non-volatile. So instead of running mid, the wave that is pushing into you, you can stay bot and you can prevent that wave from crashing. Maybe you can just hold a freeze, prevent them from crashing and basing themselves, and maybe that's something that you would want to do instead of pressuring around mid. But on the other hand, if your mid laner has setup, maybe you have like a Rise or a Syndra or a Galio or a Vex or anything that has ranged CC, then you can definitely impact around mid a lot easier. And another situation is where the mid lane matchup is melee. Assassin versus assassin, very volatile. Champs like Silas or Talon or even Zed or Kiana, the list goes on. Fizz. If they're trading aggressively, then first of all, they're going to be further away from safety from their turret. Second of all, they're using their abilities, they're putting them on cooldown so that it's easier to gank them. And third, these champs have to trade heavily. They function by being able to fight in the 1v1 and having kill threat. And if you're there to punish that, then they fall behind, obviously. And if they never use their tools because they're scared of your presence, then they also fall behind. So in those kinds of mid lane matchups, I would heavily recommend to pay a lot more attention to the mid lane when you are using your roam windows. So we've talked about mid lane identity in the laning phase. Now I want to bring our attention to Sololane identity in the mid to late game. What do your solo laners want to do? Do they want to group up and teamfight, or do they excel in the side lane? Some examples of champions that excel in the side lane. Top laners would be Jax, Fiora, Trynd, champs like those. Mid laners would be the Akalis, the LeBlancs, the Rises, who just have a lot more tools in the side lane and are not necessarily suited for front to back. They have more mobility, more single target damage, more pick, things like that. So you just want to ask yourself the question, when you see your solo laners, what do they want to do in the side lane? If you have a Jax or a Fiora or a Trynd and they're split pushing, maybe you want to play around their pressure. Maybe you want to move to their lane and facilitate them. Maybe give them vision, maybe gank their opponents. Or if your mid laner is adept in the side lane, it would be the exact same thing. You want to provide vision for them. You want them to be able to do what their champion's identity is in the mid to late game. Now, let's say you have a control mage, maybe you have like a Victor or a Syndra, and they're trying to farm in the side lane. Obviously, you don't want to be grouped up for the entirety of the game and you only farm 1 or 2 lanes. They need to be able to collect minions in the side. So what you want to do is allow them to safely farm, make sure that they don't get all-in or they don't get ganked, because that's their weakness in the side lane, and you help give them vision and space to move and group with your team around the mid lane. And once you start to think like this, it would also make you more assertive and help to carry your team in the mid to late game. If you have identified that your solo laners are adept at team fighting, at front to backing, maybe your top laner is an Ornn or a Sion, no, not necessarily a Sion in this meta, but like a Malphite or an AP Kennen who excel in the team fights, and they're split pushing the whole time. And the same with your mid laner. They're a control mage, they want the front to back, they have sustained DPS, and they're split pushing. And you would, at that stage, you would want to ping them to group, you want to set her up around objectives, get everyone there, and do what your team wants to do. The same goes if you have solo laners adept in the side lane, and there's a lot of attention around the middle of the map, which they don't want. They want picks, they want long lanes, they don't want the lanes to shorten up, they don't want front to backs. So then you would avoid grouping up in sides. You would avoid grouping up in mid, and instead tell your solo laners to instead split on the side of the map and start to use your resources, your numbers, your vision to that win condition instead. So it's all about actively thinking about what your solo lanes want to do. A lot of the times, you will have to make a decision. You will have a split pushing solo laner, and you'll have a mid laner that wants to group up and Teamfight and front to back, then you can either decide to play around your side laner, let them get prio, maybe find a pick or whatever. The rest of your team waits for a little bit, and then you either force the enemy to react to your side and then group, or you get a pick and you get a tower in the side, or you can just leave the solo laner in a 1v1 on an island in the side lane. That's what they like to do, right? They want the isolated 1v1. And then you can play the 4v4 as a grouped unit with your mid laner who wants a team fight as well. So there are a lot of variations, and the main thing I want from you guys is just to actively think, what do my solo laners want? And that's already going to be a huge step in the right direction towards mid to late game macro. If you're thinking about what they want, it's much less likely for you to autopilot. It's much more likely for you to find things to do, to be proactive, figure out how you want to use your vision and your numbers. And then a lot of the times it's your mid to late game is going to feel a lot better. Okay, with all of that being said, there was so much information and not enough examples and not enough gameplay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put a break onto all of this information and just jump into some examples and try to just wrap our heads around everything and how we should approach comps and identity. All right, the first game we're going to look at, we are going to be Caitlyn and Karma versus Twitch and Lulu. Now, what we want to do in the early laning phase is we want to be able to start in lane. I told my jungler that we want to start in lane, and I already messed up by basing so late and allowing them to enter the lane. So what I should have done is just stay in lane, either in this bush or in this bush with my Caitlyn, and we just zone them off the wave. Just because Caitlyn and Karma have a lot of poke and prio and wave clear. So this is a mistake on my end, but we're going to try and recover from that. And we're going to run through the laning phase. We're just collecting the waves for now, and eventually we're going to be able to build a wave, and once we have prio, then we can start to re-establish what Caitlyn and Karma actually want to do in the lane, which is have prio, poke, push, keep our foot on the gas, keep them under tower, things like that. So now the lane is once again in a decent spot, and we have a big wave. I'm escorting this wave into the tower. I'm making sure it crashes. I'm looking for windows to poke with my Q, and here we can see the prio coming into handy. I am the first to move to this fight. We get a couple kills here, and then we're going to move back down to bot. We're going to shove, and this is exactly what Caitlyn and Karma want to do. They just want to keep pushing, keep shoving. The start of the lane wasn't the greatest, but you know, bad things happen sometimes. It's fine. Here we're just keeping prio, shoving. They overextend. There's a bit of misplays going on here, but the identity remains the same. I'm making sure this wave crashes, and that's just going to be the story of the laning phase. How I want to play Karma. I'm an Enchanter, and I'm playing the war of attrition. And especially with Kate, we have we synergize very well, and we have a lot of tools to win the 2v2 in terms of making it a war of attrition. So they're getting poked out. We're holding the wave on our side of the lane now so that they have to overextend and potentially die. That's exactly what happens. He tries to overextend and try to crash the wave or look for a fight. Either way, it's not working out too well for them. And that's going to be the early laning phase. Now I want to jump to mid to late game. So in the mid to late game, let's ask ourselves what our solo laners want to do. We have a Nivea and we have a Yorick. Now in this game, it's especially easy to decide what our solo laners want to do. Our Yorick, he wants to pressure in the side lane and split push. Our Nivea, she wants to avoid the side lane. She's very killable in the side. She wants to group up, with our team. And what we're going to notice is that I play towards the grouping up with the team win condition, because that's what my champ wants to do. Let's say I was a Pike or a Bard or a Thresh, or maybe even one of the engaged champs like a Nautilus or Leona. I can potentially hover my Yorick on the side and allow him to shove up freely while the rest of us are wave clearing mid. I could even look to dive, but I'm Karma. My champ wants to be around mid, playing front to back, and that's just what's going to happen. I'm not going to look at specifics, just notice what my champ is doing for this entire mid game. I'm around mid. I'm not running through over here. I could die. I could get picked out around this area. We're playing the front to back around mid lane, and I'm happy. This game is a bit of a stomp, but I hope you guys can see what kind of concepts I'm trying to push forwards here, insofar as my Enchanter wants to be mid, and we have a grouped up win condition for our team here. It would be especially clear what should happen if we have a top laner that wants to group up, like a tank or like a team fighter, like a Kennen as well. We wouldn't necessarily contest for side prio over here. We would look for our top laner to move around to mid, and then we just group up in team fight and get mid prio and then set up for an objective and just play the front to back team fight. We're going to have a look at, we'll just speed through a little bit more just so I can make my point clear that I am playing around mid almost exclusively, and I'm making sure we get mid prio. And my Anivia is grouped up mid as well. And even if they're not running into us and entering, we get mid prio and we can control a side of the map or an objective if we so desire. We're now going to have a look at a very different identity, especially in the bot lane, and for the rest of the team as well. We are Alistair and Samira versus Kate Lux. Now, we are really looking for all-ins, and we want to look for all-ins, look for kill threat, look for volatility in the 2v2, and avoid it becoming a war of attrition, especially with a jungler that loves to gank early, like an Elise or like a Rek'Sai. A lot of attention is going to be put into making plays happen around the bot lane. So we're going to speed through this, the early lane. I've talked about pressuring from bush enough times from now. My jungler looks to gank. And there's a lot of volatility around here. All of these fights are exactly what our bot lane wants. We'll speed up a little bit. More fights, more ganking. And their jungler is forced to match our pressure here. And all the while, my ADC is getting fed, which is our win condition. And they're not able to just fight us in a 2v2 and siege the tower. So this is definitely helpful that our jungler is doing this. But if we did have a different jungler and the other jungler is parting to top and then their jungler doesn't have to match us in the isolated 2v2, I would be looking for opportunities to kill. Okay, so we're just going to keep playing this. I am letting the wave push into me so that they have to overextend and then potentially open themselves up to being ganked or all-ins. But anyway, this is potentially a very tricky 2v2 lane, and we're trying to inject a lot of volatility into it. And I'm going to be pressuring from fog, and I'm going to be looking for windows to punish this bot lane. I'm not going to be necessarily looking for windows to roam mid. I want to, this bot lane is very killable, and I don't want them to just have free reign for taking our tower. The other thing to keep in mind is that it is an Akali, which is a very difficult champ to gank and lock down. She has a lot of maneuverability and escape, and she can farm safely on her side of the lane. So all the more reason for focus around bot. Okay, let us jump into the mid to late game. So it's a very extended laning phase. And around here, we can call it mid to late game. And what we want to do in this kind of game state is we want to avoid team fights. We have a Jax, he wants to split push. We have a Yone, he also prefers the side lane. We have an Elise, can't team fight for the life of her. And we have a Samira and Alistair who need explosive skirmishes and all really struggle in the front to back 5v5. So with that being said, my champion is not necessarily going to be looking to force around the mid lane. So their Gragas kind of ends, but I'm moving towards side lanes here. I'm not looking to potentially pressure around mid. I really want to unlock my solo laners who are adept in the side lane. So if he just didn't die and waited for us, that would have been a free kill. But just in terms of the decisions I will be making, it's going to be around the jungle or around side lanes. And what we are going to see is an upcoming dragon fight. And it goes wrong, and I want to talk about what should have happened with a comp like this. Obviously, our jungler getting one shot is not what should happen, but if we can find a team fight where we have access to their backline and we have flanks, then that's what we want. So here I'm talking about the team fight, and I mentioned how we want our solo laners to pressure the side of the map, right? We want someone to shove this out, to get priority in the side lane in the 1v1, and then after they shove the side, then they threaten to collapse onto the enemies. But just straight up engaging in a 5v5 front to back, they have their tanky front line at the front, they have their squishies at the back. It's very hard for us to access their backline. And so this is just a really bad fight. I don't really want to do anything here, but we've kind of already committed, and it's just, I try to go for a copium engage, and it just turns bad really quickly. But this is failing to play to our identity as a team. Like I said, we want to push sides, and we want to either force them to show on the side, and then we group up here, or if they don't show on the side, our side laner can threaten to flank. And by threatening to flank, they have access to the backline, and that's how we would want to approach a fight. So if you find yourself in a position like this, and what I should have done, I should have been a lot more vocal in calling for my team to push the sides, just because of the nature of our solo laners. If we had solo laners that are great at team fighting, then we wouldn't necessarily have to do that. So what we also could have done is decided that our comp is not good in this front to back 5v5, and we give over mid control. We don't contest mid pressure, and instead we either let them enter the river and then we enter through mid after they enter the river, or we sack mid completely, enter through bot river as a team, or like I said, we find a flank from one of our solo laners. Alright, so for this game, we are set, we are an engager support, and we're just going to look at the mid to late game for this one. So, you can take stock of what has happened. Our bot lane is really far ahead. We have a front to back win condition with our fed ADC, and what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that we have mid priority, and with our mid priority, we can group up and we can play the team fights. Our mid laner is struggling a little bit, and our top laner is also struggling a little bit, losing in the 1v1. So the win condition is going to be around our bot lane, around grouping up, forcing mid prior if possible, otherwise team fighting in the front to back. So here we are grouping up around the next objective, which is the dragon, and I'm posturing to find and engage. And if they contest this dragon, I will engage on them and they will die. I will Hex Flash, combo their entire team. I have ult, I have my Hex Flash E, and they realize that they can't contest. I was making sure that I was sitting on fog as well. And instead they try to just run up through mid. And we managed to find a team fight. I was able to access their whole team, their backline, and it's just a pretty easy team fight. And this is going to happen a lot in solo queue as well. Teams are not going to be willing to just concede and do nothing. So here they did concede the dragon, but they wanted to get something out of it. They try to just desperately run up through mid, but now their backline is completely exposed. I can find a really easy engage, and yeah, the rest is history. So the reason that I am playing around mid this game and looking to play around neutrals and teamfight is because I've identified that that is our win con. Our side laner, our Gwen, is too far behind, and I don't want to put any pressure towards the Gwen's lane. If I did move to Gwen's lane and we don't have complete information on the enemy team and I get counter ganked, we're both going to for sure die. And even if I don't get counter ganked, the side laner is so far behind we might even get 2v1'd. And this is why you want to play around your win condition, not necessarily help people who are behind. And yeah, just slow down your lose condition, I guess. So for my previous VODs that I had a look at, the win condition was quite straightforward. Everyone more or less played into that win condition. This, however, is a game where my student was playing Pyke, and he had a team comp that was quite focused around the front to back and the team fighting. But Pyke really does not like that. So here we'll have to do a little bit of thinking in this kind of situation as to what your win condition is and compare it to the enemy's win condition. So let's just have a quick look at the enemy team. They have Kai'Sa, which is very volatile, wants fights, early snowballs, skirmishes, and laning. Rise, who wants to scale up into the side lane and be unkillable and get permanent priority. And then they have a Karma who wants to group up as well. But just appreciating both of these comps, blue team wants to group up and play around the Hecarim front to back. And red team wants to try to get some chaotic fights and skirmishes going on, some picks, maybe some fights around the side lane with Kai'Sa that can join, with Nautilus's pick, with Rise's priority. And even though Pyke doesn't like that kind of game plan in terms of playing front to back around mid, that's what his champion has to do in this situation. So what we're going to see is that he didn't properly identify what needed to happen. And there was too much volatility in the laning phase. So this was very scary. They could have died in the laning phase there. But what needs to go through his mind is that he just needs to play towards the win condition, which is farm up safely, prevent the Kai'Sa and Nautilus from snowballing and finding picks and early kills, allow your mid and your jungler to farm up, and then once they have farmed up sufficiently, you can just group up, force mid prio, stack neutrals, and win the game like that. The clearest example of mismanaging the win condition is here when our Pyke and Aphelios are injecting a lot of volatility into the 2v2. So there's a big fight, big trade here, and they lose 2v2, they lose the laning phase, and they just need to scale up and play around their mid-jungle front to back. But now they're very low, they lose 2v2, they can't control the wave state as they need to, and they're either going to get frozen on or they're just going to get killed. And here the jungler comes, and this wouldn't be possible for them to do if they were just playing the weak side appropriately, just scaling up, staying healthy, playing towards that win condition. and also denying the enemy team win condition. If they don't get these picks and snowballs, then they're going to really struggle to win the game. So I could talk about different examples and different compositions for hours, but the main point I want to get across is that you're actively thinking about your composition, the enemy team's composition, and what your win condition is. Have a plan for the early game. Have a plan for the mid to late game. Think about what your champ does. How do you want to play the lane? How do you want to use your roam windows? Do you want to move towards mid? Do you want to more so control bots? Is your mid lane matchup volatile or not? Your bot lane identity as a whole, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to push, poke? Do you want to look for all-ins? And I know this is a lot of information to all keep in mind, but just take a deep breath and start with your champion, then think about your bot lane, and just go from there. So especially in the mid to late, I'm really excited about these concepts because it can bring a lot of structure to something that has a lot of variability. There's so many different things that can happen in the mid to late game, but if you just stop for a second and think about your solo laners, they're the ones who have access to the waves, who can pressure the map. What do they want to do? What should they do? And if they're not doing what they should do, maybe you can help them out. Or maybe you can not go for plays that wouldn't work, that isn't in accordance with your champion's identities. So last time, to summarize, think about your champion identity. Are you an engager, an enchanter, a mage, a playmaker? What are your strengths? What do you want to do? How do you want to pressure the map and contribute to the win condition? In the bot lane, have a think about what your ADC likes to do as well, and then try to figure out what works best for both of your champions. Can you adjust your play to match their identity? Can you maybe adjust your pick to match their identity? Are you both looking for the same thing, in which case that's great and your decision should be quite straightforward? Thinking about the mid lane matchup. Is it volatile? Is it safely farming? Do you want to move towards mid, or do you rather want to group with your jungler or set up something bot? And then in the mid to late, have a look at your solo laners. Is it going to be pressuring through a side laner, or is it going to be looking to group up, get mid prio, and fight around a neutral objective in a front to back? So if you've made it this far, I salute you. That was a lot of content, and thanks for sticking around. I would even advise you to approach this video sequentially and maybe wrap your head around each of the segments first, so you can just get an understanding, just digest it, have a think about what you would do in your games when you're approaching comps. But otherwise, yeah, thanks again for watching. And as always, feel free to join my School of Support Discord server for coaching, for useful support resources, and for chatting with like-minded support players. Thanks for watching. Bye.